So the debate about why Stalin instigated the terror. How did it come to this? What possible reasons could explain such widespread and ruthless application of terror? And how is it managed? How is it sustained? These are all legitimate questions, and the business of history is to try and answer them. But of course, and you should not be surprised by this, explanations vary. The traditional view held in the West, it points to Stalin as the key to any explanation. It was Stalin who instigated the terror and directed it in order to control the party and the country at large. Whether out of a rational, cold-blooded calculation that this would be the best means to exert total dominance over party and country, or an irrational paranoia, seeing plots where plots didn't exist, Stalin's role was still central, though it was also a product of the system and its brutal nature, which had been established by Lenin. Some historians focus on the assertion that Stalin wasn't as secure in power as he had seemed to be. The Ryazan affair is evidence of that. And alternative leaders were still around. Kamenev, Zinoviev, Bukharin, even Trotsky. The 5-year plans, and the second was underway as the purges began. Even the first, that was said to have met all its targets after just 4 years, were not as successful as the propaganda had people believe. And there were enough people in the party aware of that for Stalin, the creator of the plans, to be concerned about. It's worth noting that by the time the purges were over, something like 1.8 million party members, 1.8 million, or 60% of the party, had been expelled, or else something worse had happened to them, the gulag or execution. And 1 million new members were recruited to replace them, transforming the party into a Stalinist party. Lenin's democratic centralism was certainly a thing of the past. Also, the military were a potential threat. They were the old guard of Bolsheviks who had won the Civil War. Some were even from the old Tsarist regime. And the army had the means, as armies always do, to usurp power if they felt the need. The NKVD, too, had the means to mount a challenge, and so both army and NKVD were ruthlessly purged. Or was it the result of an irrational paranoia, seeing plots where plots simply didn't exist? Stalin's experience at the hands of the Tsarist regime should be considered in this respect. Stalin knew how the subversive operated, and he knew how the state should respond. He had been a subversive himself and had been the victim of state vigilance. But there is another school of thought with a focus on the ideology and on the revolution. This is the view that Stalin was acting determinedly to direct the revolution towards its socialist goals, whereas Trotsky and the left would have taken it too far, too fast. The likes of Bukharin, Rykov and Tomsky were set on slowing it down, and having thwarted Trotsky, a showdown with the right was necessary, or the revolution would remain stuck and the NEP with its kulaks and Nepmen would soon return. Stalin himself, in a speech to the Central Committee meeting in March 1937, spoke of the fierce opposition the revolution was facing. He's quoted in Robert Galate's book, and if I use that quote, this is what he says: "The further we move forward, the more success we will have. The greater the fury can we expect from what remains of the defeated exploiting classes. The more intense will be the struggle they put up, the harder they will try to harm the Soviet state, and the more desperate they will become as they grasp to the last resort of the doomed. It must be kept in mind that the vestiges of the defeated classes in the Soviet Union are not alone. They are directly supported by enemies beyond the borders of the Soviet Union, and we must be aware of this. And so, they will keep up their desperate sorties. This is what history teaches us. This is what Leninism teaches us. We have to remember this and stay on the alert." That's what Stalin said to the Central Committee, and nobody was more alert than Stalin. It justified his attack on reformers, on spies, on saboteurs, and ultimately on Trotskyites. And it justified his attacks on the likes of kulaks and to socially dangerous elements or socially harmful elements, for they could all weaken the will to defend the revolution. This view sees the Great Terror as a means of cleansing society of former people, old ways, old values. The revolution had made a lot of enemies, former kulaks or Nepmen, former priests, any of the purged bourgeois experts. They could have reinvented themselves and be living in the towns and cities, hiding their past and nursing their hatred for the regime that had turned their lives upside down. Or there were their sons with grudges of their own, as their lives too had been sent down a path they hadn't expected. That, of course, is why relatives of opponents of the revolution had to perish as well. Innocents had to pay the price so that the majority were made safe. Nothing could be left to chance. Molotov, when later asked about the need for such widespread terror, had this to say, and I'm using Robert Galate's book again. Molotov said, "It is certainly sad and regrettable that so many innocent people died, but I believe the terror of the late 1930s was necessary. Of course, if we had used greater caution, there would have been fewer victims. But Stalin was adamant on making doubly sure, spare no one, but guarantee absolute stability in the country for a long time." And he added that it was no doubt achieved. Also adding that it was hard to draw a precise line as to where to stop. But there's another view that this was really a continuation of what Lenin had started. In 1921, Lenin did instigate his own huge purge of the party. In percentage terms, it was something like 25% of members were removed from the party lists. And this, by no means, was his only purge. But the view shared by Trotsky, as well as some historians, is that it was indeed very different to Stalin's terror. Lenin had used terror, yes, but against enemies of the Bolsheviks in their revolution, not against themselves. Purges of the party were made to rid it of those who had joined the party for self-gain, not because they agreed with Bolshevik principles, and he didn't remove them because they disagreed with himself. As Lenin put it, he was ridding the party of the rascals, the bureaucrats, corrupt or fickle communists, and Mensheviks who put on a new coat of paint on their facade but were still Mensheviks at heart. Whereas Stalin set out to destroy those who dared disagree with his policies. Yes, he did so claiming he was defending the revolution, and he did include in his assault former people, but this is still open to question. It is just as easy to interpret his actions as those of someone who would never be satisfied until their power was absolute, and who would brook no opposition. Or, as some interpret his personality and his actions, a paranoid, deeply suspicious of others, even when there was no reason to be so. But we're left with a final question. Was Stalin even in control of the Great Terror? Stalin's directives were enthusiastically seized on by local officials, who saw Stalin as the saviour who would save the revolution and make the Soviet Union a strong country, a major player in the world. What is more, amongst the people, if not local party officials, obedience to distanced authority was almost ingrained in the Russian DNA, whereas a sense of civil rights was not. But the size of the Soviet Union surely points to a large degree of local initiative. And here, the characteristic of revolutionary communism was just as brutal as Stalin's personal character, as indeed was Russian society just as brutal. The NKVD lost control, the argument says, particularly at a local level. Local party officials or just ordinary members used the purges to settle scores and advance themselves. A coveted, prestigious position and the privileges that go with it must have been enough to tempt many, especially when all that was needed was any kind of denunciation to trigger a person's fall from grace. And no NKVD officer could run the risk of lacking vigilance in such a climate. And evidence was never needed, just a confession, and they knew how to acquire those. This was more a feature than it might otherwise have been as a result of so many party members at all levels of the party owing their position to Stalin. And so, in this sense, the Great Purge, at least, can be seen as being fueled from the bottom up. But as a final comment that maybe swings it back to Stalin was in control, I would mention the quotas that had to be filled, the quotas of victims. So you've had episode 1, why did Stalin introduce the terror? But there's a debate about that between historians, and they focus on different factors. And that is going to be the focus of my second video. Why did Stalin introduce the terror? The debate.